Hi everyone, welcome back to the channel. In this video, we'll be learning about the ulna. We'll be discussing its site determination, bony landmarks, and muscle attachments. So stay tuned till the end of the video and let's get started. So first of all, we need to determine the side of ulna. It's really easy to determine the side of ulna. So first of all, we need to distinguish between the proximal end and the distal end. The proximal end of the ulna is hook-like, as you can see here. It's really prominent, while the distal end is narrow and possesses an ulnar styloid. The ulnar styloid should always project posteromedially or medially, to keep it simple. The sharp interosseous border of the ulna right here should always project laterally, while on the lateral aspect of the ulna we should also see a radial notch. On the medial aspect there is no radial notch. So considering all of these points, we come to the conclusion that this ulna is of the left side, because the radial styloid is projecting posteromedially, the sharp interosseous border is located laterally, and the radial notch is also located laterally. The proximal end is hook-like and the distal end is narrow and possesses an ulnar styloid. However, if we place this bone on the right forearm, we see that the radial styloid is not projecting posteromedially. Also, the radial notch right here, as you can see, the radial notch is also located medially, which should not be the case. So we come to the conclusion that this ulna is of the left side. So if we talk about the ulna is the medial bone of the forearm. However, it is homologous with the fibula of the lower limb. Fibula is the lateral bone of the leg. So you may be wondering why ulna, which is the medial bone of forearm, is homologous to the lateral bone of the leg. That is because during embryological development, during the rotation of the limbs in the 6th and 8th weeks of embryological development, the lower limb rotates medially and the upper limb relative to the lower limb will rotate laterally. So that's why the relative positions of the bones of the upper limb and lower limb are different, and this is a very important concept. So if we start with the ulna, with the bony features, so we see that the ulna is a typical long bone. Like all typical long bones, the ulna consists of an upper part, the proximal part of the ulna. We have a diaphysis or the shaft of the ulna. We also have a lower end or the distal end of the ulna. The best way to identify ulna is to look for this hook. The only bone in the body which has a hook-like projection is the ulna. No other bone in the body has this kind of hook-like projection. So it's really so you can't really miss the ulna during the viva. The ulna on the proximal aspect presents the trochlear notch. This is called the trochlear notch right here. This hook-like projection is known as the trochlear notch. The trochlear notch consists of two parts. It has the olecranon. This is the olecranon, and this is the coronoid part. So this is known as the olecranon process, and this is known as the coronoid process. The olecranon process articulates with the olecranon fossa of the humerus when the elbow is fully extended. However, the coronoid process comes into contact with the coronoid fossa of the humerus distal end when the elbow is fully flexed. So moving on to the bony features of the ulna, we'll move in a systematic order. We'll first discuss the bony features on the proximal end, then we'll move on to the shaft and then the distal end finally. So the proximal end of the ulna possesses the hook-shaped projection called the trochlea. Trochlea in its upper part, this upper part of the trochlea is called as the olecranon process. This is called the olecranon process, while the lower part is called the coronoid process. This is the coronoid process. The olecranon process has 5 surfaces. This is the anterior surface. The anterior surface forms the upper part of the articular surface of the trochlea with the humerus, with the humeral condyle, that is the trochlea, and this helps form the elbow joint. While there is also superior surface of the olecranon process right here. This is the posterior surface. Posterior surface is rough and it is separated from the skin by a bursa. While we have the lateral surface right here, this is the lateral surface of olecranon process, and finally this is the medial surface. So moving on to the coronoid process, the coronoid process, like the olecranon process, has a superior surface. This is the superior surface right here. Superior surface forms the lower part of the articular surface of elbow joint, we have the anterior surface. The anterior surface is rough in its lower part and it forms the ulnar tuberosity. The lateral surface of the coronoid process, this bears a radial notch. This is the radial notch right here. This is the radial notch, and radial notch articulates with the disc-shaped head of the radius to form the proximal radio-ulnar joint. If you haven't yet watched my video on radius, I'll link it up here. So, continuing, we have the crest-like projection just below the radial notch right here. This crest-like projection is called the supinator crest. On the medial surface of the coronoid process, we don't really have any prominent bony features. So, these are all of the features of the coronoid process and the olecranon process. So, moving on to the shaft of the ulna, we see that the shaft has 3 borders and it has 3 surfaces. So, the first of all, we'll talk about the borders. So, the borders of the shaft of the ulna, we have the anterior border. This is the anterior border. The anterior border extends from the medial margin of the coronoid process above to the styloid process below, right here. We have the lateral border. The lateral border is sharp. It's really sharp to touch, and the lateral border extends from the supinator crest above all the way down to the head of the radius below. We also have a posterior subcutaneous border which can be easily palpated on the posterior aspect of the forearm. It starts from the posterior rough surface of the olecranon process and it extends all the way down to the radial to the ulnar styloid. We also have surfaces. We have 3 surfaces to the ulna. We have the anterior surface right here, an anterior surface between the anterior border and the lateral interosseous border. We have the medial surface between the anterior border and the posterior border, and we also have the lateral surface. The lateral surface is between the lateral interosseous border right here, the sharp one, and the posterior border. So that's all for the surfaces and the borders on the ulna. The distal aspect of the ulna, as you can see right here, is called the head. This is the head of the ulna. The head of the ulna can be differentiated easily from the proximal aspect because it is not hook-like. Secondly, it possesses the styloid process, the ulnar styloid. The ulnar styloid in the anatomical position lies posterior medially. The distal end of the ulna also possesses an anterior aspect. We have the posterior aspect. We have the lateral aspect, and we also have the medial aspect. The medial aspect consists of the ulnar styloid. The surface of the anterior aspect is smooth, and the ulnar artery and the ulnar nerve move on the anterior aspect. The lateral aspect of the head of the ulna articulates with the ulnar notch on the radius to form the distal radio-ulnar joint, while the posterior aspect of the head of the radius possesses a groove. The groove is present between the head of the ulna and the styloid process. The groove helps channel the tendon of the extensor carpi ulnaris. We also have the medial aspect of the distal end. The medial aspect of the distal end, as mentioned earlier, contains the styloid process. So that was all it for the major bony landmarks and the salient features of the ulna. Let's move on to the muscle attachments. So moving on to the muscle attachments on the ulna, we'll again move in a systematic order. We'll start from the proximal end, then we'll discuss the attachments on the shaft, and then we'll move on to the distal end. So before starting the muscle attachments, please note that the red color symbolizes the origin of muscles, the blue color symbolizes the insertion of muscles, while the green color represents the attachments of tendons, joint capsules, and ligaments. So let's start from the proximal end. The proximal end of the ulna consists of the trochlear notch, which has 2 parts. As mentioned earlier, the upper part, the olecranon process. So the olecranon process possesses the insertion of the triceps brachia in the posterior superior part. On the medial aspect, or on the medial surface of the olecranon process, we have the part of origin of flexor digitorum profundus. On the lateral aspect, or on the lateral surface of the olecranon process, we have the insertion of the anconeus muscle. So on the coronoid process, we see that we have the anterior surface. On the anterior surface, we have the insertion of brachialis. The insertion of brachialis extends from the anterior surface of the coronoid process and it goes all the way down to the ulnar tuberosity. The ulnar tuberosity also gives attachment to the oblique cord. On the lateral aspect of the coronoid process, we have the radial notch and the supinator crest. The supinator crest gives origin to the supinator muscle, while the radial notch has an anterior margin and the posterior margin. The anterior margin and posterior margin give attachment to the annular ligament. On the medial margin of the coronoid process, in the upper part we have the origin of the flexor digitorum superficialis right here. The small origin is the flexor digitorum superficialis. On the lower part of the medial margin of the coronoid process, we have the origin of the pronator teres muscle. Also, on the margins of the articular surfaces of the coronoid process and the olecranon process, we have the attachment of the joint capsule for the elbow joint. So that was it for the attachments on the proximal end of the ulna. Now let's move on to the shaft of the ulna. The shaft of the ulna has an anterior surface, we have the medial surface, and we have the posterior surface. We also have three borders: the anterior border, the sharp lateral interosseous border right here, and we also have the posterior subcutaneous border. So we see that the upper part of the medial border of the shaft of ulna possesses the origin of the flexor digitorum profundus. The origin of flexor digitorum profundus is quite large, and it extends from the medial aspect of the olecranon process. It also extends down to the medial aspect of coronoid process. Then it extends down to the upper part of the medial surface of the ulna, and it also expands onto the upper part or the upper thirds of the anterior surface of the ulna. So the origin of the flexor digitorum profundus is quite large. On the anterior surface, we have the origin of the flexor digitorum profundus in its upper half, and on the lower part, on the anterior surface of the shaft of the ulna, we have the origin of the pronator quadratus muscle. Moving on to the posterior surface, we have the origin of three muscles. These muscles are the extensor pollicis longus right here, extensor pollicis longus. We have the origin of abductor pollicis longus, and we also have the origin of the extensor indicis muscle. So from top to bottom, the origin of abductor pollicis longus, extensor pollicis longus, extensor indicis. It is very important to note that the origins of the abductor pollicis longus, extensor pollicis longus, and the extensor indicis span partly onto the interosseous membrane, as shown in the picture. The posterior border mainly, right here, we see the posterior border of the shaft of ulna. We have the origin of the flexor carpi ulnaris muscle, and below the origin of the flexor carpi ulnaris, we have the origin of extensor carpi ulnaris. The posterior subcutaneous border of the ulna also gives attachment to the to an aponeurosis. The aponeurosis is basically attaching or continuous with the deep fascia on the posterior aspect of the forearm, and it divides the forearm into three compartments. On the distal aspect of the ulna, there aren't many muscle attachments. However, we see on the styloid process we have the attachment of the ulnar collateral ligament of the wrist joint. Also, on the posterior aspect of the distal end of the ulna, we see that we have a groove. The groove is present between the head of the ulna and the styloid process. This groove channels the tendon of the extensor carpi ulnaris into the wrist. So that was all it for the muscle attachments on the ulna. So that brings us to the end of the video. Hope you guys enjoyed. If you did, please leave a like, subscribe, and do press the bell icon to receive the latest updates on my videos, and share this video with your friends, and yeah, stay healthy and blessed, and see you next time.